Welcome once again to Why Should We Care About the Indo-Pacific, brought to you by IEJ Media and our sponsor, BauerGroupAsia.com. We will tell you more about them in due course. I'm Ray Powell, a former military officer. That's Jim Caruso, the former diplomat. How are you, Jim?
All well. I'm looking forward to today because I am so tired of getting these come-ons from unknown people.
Well, I don't know if our guest is going to be able to put a stop to that, but she certainly has done a lot of reporting on it. So just to kind of give a little background, we've done a lot of reporting about interviews that touched on the issue of scam compounds running in Asia. In episode 9, we had Ambassador Scott Marciel told us about the vast scam compounds that were thriving in the ungoverned spaces of war-torn Myanmar. In episode 19, we talked to Senator Risa Hontiveros in the Philippines, who talked about similar compounds there. And of course, that bizarre case of the mystery mayor, Alice Guo, who became the face of the Philippine offshore gaming operations, or POGOs. In episode 32, we talked to Michael Brzezowski about human trafficking in Vietnam and how Vietnamese citizens were being trafficked into Myanmar and Laos and Cambodia into these scam compounds. So we've known about the scam compounds. On the other hand, we all get the little strange texts and emails and social media messages that we know are scams, and we don't really think about who's actually doing it. But our guest today has, and she is the Economist magazine reporter, Sue-Lin Wong. She has tied it all together by releasing an incredible and very chilling 8-episode podcast about what she has come to call Scam Inc. And if you don't think you should care about this, I think that Sue-Lin's got a wake-up call for you. So, Sue-Lin, you talked about in the podcast series, you talked about the online scam industry, and you called it the most shocking story you've never heard of. So, we all kind of know there are scammers out there, but why should we care about Scam Inc.?
Because it touches every single one of us, whether we know it or not, and whether we have already had direct contact or whether direct contact is coming soon. And I think that's what is so shocking about this multi-billion-dollar industry, that, it started in China. It was mostly Chinese criminals scamming Chinese people. And then the Chinese Communist Party cracked down and pushed these criminals out into Southeast Asia, where they continue to mostly scam Chinese people. Until COVID, there were a whole bunch of factors that made them realize, we can actually scam the whole world. And so now this is the biggest crime in Singapore, where I live. It's overtaken traditional felonies like theft to become the biggest crime that the Singapore police force is now trying to tackle. And then anecdotally, I've heard in countries like the US and the UK, it is one of, if not the biggest crime. But the problem is that governments are so far behind that they don't even have accurate reporting systems to track whether this genuinely is the biggest crime or not, because people often don't understand what's happening to them when they are being scammed or have been scammed. And even after a scam, there's often so much shame or denial, understandably, because it's so embarrassing for so many people that, again, people aren't necessarily reporting this horrific crime. And so what we've actually seen is this industry is now probably worth more than $500 billion every year, which would make it bigger than the global illicit drug trade. And I just think we all need to be talking about it so much more. And we all need a bit of a wake-up call for what the criminals are already doing and what is coming, given they have so much money and they're able to buy the best and latest technology, especially in AI. And then the only other thing I would add, beyond this is coming for all of us, this is an industry bigger than the illicit drug trade. The third thing I would say is we've just witnessed the biggest shift in modern history in how transnational crime works. So I think we might have all seen The Godfather and other mafia movies, and we have an image that, there's maybe a gang and there's a kingpin at the top, and, below him there's some tattooed gangsters. That is just not the model globally now in how transnational crime works. What we're seeing is, rather than a very hierarchical structure, it's a very loose network. It's kind of like the gig economy for the underworld. And so what we'll see is lots of small groups that just do a little tiny part of the scamming supply chain. So one group might just kidnap people. Another group might just upload American SIM cards to iPhones in Southeast Asia. A third group might just do one tiny part of the money laundering puzzle. And that makes it a really huge challenge for law enforcement because you can't really go after the kingpin and shut the whole industry down.
So maybe there's so much to unpack. Let's start with, why is it necessary to kidnap people?
It's a great question. Yes. So the United Nations in 2023 found that just under 250,000 people were being held against their will and forced to scam inside these industrial-sized scam compounds in just 2 countries in the world, Myanmar and Cambodia. And since then, we've seen these scam compounds proliferate all around the world to places as disparate as Peru, Ghana, Dubai, Georgia, Fiji. One was even discovered on the Isle of Man between England and Ireland last year. So it's a problem that started in Southeast Asia, which is the beat I cover, and it's spreading all across the world. And there's an estimated perhaps 500,000 people who are involved in the actual scamming, and then according to the United States Institute of Peace, perhaps 1.5 million people who are involved in the broader network I just described that in my podcast series I've named Scam Inc.
So, Sue-Lin, you talked about going to one of these compounds in Manila that the Philippine government has essentially maintained in the condition that it was in when they basically took it over. It was really horrifying. What was the experience like going through that compound?
So, I guess of all the countries in Southeast Asia, the Philippines has been relatively less affected compared to, say, Myanmar, Cambodia, Laos. But there are still hundreds of scam compounds in the Philippines, which is pretty extraordinary given, it's an American ally. Nearly 1 million Americans travel there on holidays every year. And so the government in the Philippines has started doing raids across the country to try to crack down on these scam compounds. But I think it's really difficult. Based on my discussions with law enforcement in the Philippines, they say often the criminals are several steps ahead of them. But they did do a raid in downtown Manila in 2023 on one compound. And it was extraordinary because in order to get there, I just walked through this very pleasant, leafy neighborhood in Manila. There were residential apartments all around me. And then I suddenly arrived at what looked like an apartment compound. But there was a lot of security and to get in. And it turned out it had been a former scam compound with hundreds of people trapped inside, forced to scam people all over the world. And the government repurposed it after the raid as their own offices to preserve it as a museum, but also as a way to save money because they still had to pay, the utilities bills. And so when I spoke to the government, they said, well, we figured let's just use it ourselves for offices. And sorry, the only thing I'd add in terms of what I remember visiting this former scam compound is that there are still people outside who we assume have connections to the criminal syndicates who take photos of every single person who goes in and out. So our photos were taken when we left the compound, and for the people who work in the Presidential Anti-Organized Crime Commission, they live in the compound because they don't want the criminal syndicates to follow them home to their families.
And I just wanted to follow up on one other thing, because you sort of described what could only be described as torture chambers.
That's right. So yes, gosh, I haven't even gotten inside the compound to describe what I saw. But the Philippine government has really tried to preserve it in the state it was found in. And I was given a tour. And so first I walked by a couple of staffers who were like fiddling with an enormous karaoke machine that the criminals presumably left behind, trying to figure out, how to turn it on. And then there was another staff member that rode by on a hoverboard, presumably also previously owned by a criminal. But then I was taken to this room. It just looked like a room in an office building. And they opened the door for me, and it was a torture chamber. And so there was this sort of metal bar along the wall that previously was used to hook handcuffs into. And people who were not scamming enough money would be handcuffed to that metal bar and then tasered and tortured. And the wall, I tapped on it, was cardboard, because the whole point was the criminal bosses wanted everyone in the building to know people were getting tortured, as a sort of warning that if you don't scam enough, if you don't work enough, you're going to be tasered next.
So you can hear the screams coming from, yeah.
And I was also told by the person who gave me the tour that when they found the room, it was covered in blood, and they had to clean that up. And then I was also told, I mean, this is very common. I visited some other scam compounds that the Philippine government had raided, and there were torture chambers found in a lot of them.
All right, so these are people who are doing this against their will, the worker bees, or is it a mix, or is it this is a productivity tool, for crying out loud? What's the deal there?
That's right. Yes, you're exactly right. So it's a complicated picture, but sometimes the low-level scammers are victims of human trafficking, and other times they're volunteers. So they opted to join this industry, which I think initially I found very, very hard to wrap my head around. You know, why would anyone choose to be a low-level scammer? But when you think about it, in Southeast Asia, in most countries in this region, the average wage is a couple of $100 a month. So if the option is unemployment or toiling under the sweltering sun as a farmer, it's understandable why, I'm not saying it's right, but it's understandable why multilingual university grads in this region who want to feed their families might opt to go into one of these scam compounds. And I think it's often that they don't understand there could be all this torture and horror, because it's, I interviewed people who told me that another punishment was to get sent to the brothel, which is often, co-located in the scam compound, and you're forced to become a sex worker. And then there's just been countless stories I've heard of suicides and other real tragedies where people cannot take the physical, emotional, mental torture anymore and kill themselves to escape. So it's just a complete horror show. And some people are trafficked, and then there are other people who perhaps enter voluntarily without realizing what exactly they're getting themselves into.
Now, when you started your series, you didn't start in Myanmar or the Philippines. You started in Kansas. Why did you start in Kansas?
So I had been covering the rise of online scams in Southeast Asia, and I would ask my sources, this is such a shocking story. I can't wrap my head around this, but what's the most shocking part of it that you've come across so far? And I mean, we've already spoken about some really, really shocking bits, but I was told, didn't a bank collapse in Kansas? And somehow that bank collapse was connected to what we were seeing day in, day out in Southeast Asia. And so I decided to go to rural Kansas, to the tiny town of Elkhart in southwestern Kansas. There's about 2,000 people who live there. I showed up with my producer. Everyone was very confused and very suspicious because no one in Elkhart looks like me or sounds like me. They didn't really know what to make of me. And so we ended up having to first just turn off our microphones, and we spent a day just chatting to the locals and trying to explain what we were doing, because I think understandably the town was incredibly scarred by the collapse of their local bank that was pretty beloved and set up in the 80s by locals from that town. And we were very fortunate that in the end, the locals were very hospitable and gracious and ended up sitting down with us and sharing their stories. And so that really is the through line of Scam Inc. I start with this bank collapse in Kansas and just how confused and bewildered these people in this tiny town in the American Midwest were, about what exactly happened. How did the CEO of this bank, who again was a very well-respected member of the town, he had 3 daughters who he raised in this town. He was very involved in the high school. He was a part-time pastor, had been CEO for many years. How did he fall for a scam and end up embezzling $47 million such that the bank he ran collapsed? And that sets me off on my journey into the dark, dark world of Scam Inc.
So is there a common theme in the scams? An approach? Is it playing on greed or sex, or what vice is it looking at?
Yeah, you've hit the nail on the head. I'm obsessed.
Sorry.
That was Jim's iPhone answering the question for him. So
and we're not.
we'll leave that in.
That is funny.
I think this is the time you tell us about pig butchering, Sue-Lin.
Sure. Does Dim need to set me up again, or was that?
No, we're going to keep
Okay.
all that stuff. That's great. That's great content.
So at the heart of this industry is this scam called pig butchering. And it perhaps has a slightly quirky or distinctive name, but that's because it's a direct translation of the Chinese term 杀猪盘, which is all about a criminal trying to identify a so-called pig that is a victim and fattening them up, so building trust with them before going in for the slaughter, to butcher them, to kill the pig by stealing their money. So this would be by far the most lucrative scam in Scam Inc. in the industry. But the reality is these Chinese criminal syndicates and now other syndicates who are coming in because there's so much money to be made are incredibly innovative and nimble and entrepreneurial. So they're actually running all kinds of different scams. There's government impersonation scams where they'll pretend to be the tax office or a police officer or customs and convince you owe the government money. There's job scams where they approach you pretending there's a job opportunity for you and you get sucked in to a scam. There's malware scams. It's really interesting. Now that the podcast series has come out, I'm getting a lot of emails and messages from people all over the world saying, can you explain what this might be? I think it's a scam. You know, I wanted to buy a video game and I was told to go and download this app. So, you know, they're constantly changing the kinds of scams, but at the core is this concept of pig butchering, which is you eventually are convinced to put money in and you can't get that money out. So that's sort of how the industry has really grown. But to Jim's question on what is the psychology? Because that's actually perhaps the question I'm most obsessed with. Like, why do people fall for scams and how do people fall for scams? These criminals have honed their scams mostly on mainland Chinese victims and really deeply understand human vulnerabilities, human frailties. And they will find our weaknesses, whatever they are, whether it's greed or fear or loneliness or lust or grief. You know, they go after people who have just lost their partner, even boredom or just being tired. You know, for the malware scams, all you need is to not be concentrating at the end of a long day and you click on the wrong link and that's that. And so once they identify our weaknesses, they have a whole toolkit of psychological tactics that they can use. So in the case of a pig butchering scam, which is sometimes romantic, they might start by love bombing you and just showering you with compliments and love and being there all the time and messaging you good morning at the start of your day and messaging you good night at the end of your day. And then once they feel like they've built trust, they'll shift and, you know, they'll start gaslighting you, or they'll use a sense of fear or a sense of urgency or anger to get you to invest money. And those psychological tactics are also very, very sophisticated, and there's so many different ones they deploy.
I was thinking about, you know, you were talking in some of your episodes, you talk about people who fall for these things and have a hard time even when presented with clear evidence that it's a scam, have a hard time letting go because of the way that they felt with the person, the imaginary person they developed a relationship with. And, so that they don't know how to let go. I mean, you talked about this one widower, elderly man who had this long running relationship with what he thought was a younger woman who was, just, and even though by the end he knew pretty much that she wasn't real, he just had such a hard time because of how he felt when she would, when the imaginary person was thought that he was worth having a relationship with.
That's right. So I actually really struggled to find a scam victim who could articulate what exactly happened to them in a very coherent way. And at first I was getting really frustrated with myself. I was like, what's wrong with me? Why can't I find someone? Then I realized actually it's completely understandable that for the vast majority of people, it's so difficult to comprehend what has just happened to them, because on the very same day, they've lost the two things in life that we all value the most, someone who loves us and the ability to feed ourselves. And I worked on this investigation for a whole year, and I still find this story completely shocking. So to come to this completely cold, lose what you think is the love of your life as well as your life savings, and have no understanding that there is a whole multi-billion-dollar industry behind the text messages that you're being sent, makes me sort of understand completely why so many people are either in denial or just genuinely do not understand what has happened to them. And it's a huge, huge challenge for law enforcement and for banks, because, how do we as a society stop people from sending all their money to these criminal groups if the psychological manipulation from the criminals is so effective?
Right. Let's go on with that. So what is, in Singapore, I know they've passed a lot of new regulations about trying to cut down the scams. What seems to be working? What sort of efforts is the government making with the banks to try and cut this down?
So I would argue that there are a few countries in Asia that are really at the forefront of their anti-scams policies, perhaps because, all of this started in Asia. And so governments here have had a bit of a head start. So in a way, I would argue that for governments in the West, say the US or the UK, looking to what governments in Asia are doing now could be quite helpful to see what's coming in the next few years for Americans and Europeans. So the country I really hone in on is Singapore, not only because I live here, but because based on my reporting, it's considered sort of world-class in its anti-scam response. And there's a real all-of-society approach here. Just walking out of my house in the morning, I see anti-scam messages at the bus stop, on taxis, on my coffee mug. But at the heart of the government policy is the anti-scam command, which is run by the Singapore police force and physically located in the same office as the police fighting scams are the banks and e-commerce platforms. And the idea being that if a Singaporean gets scammed, they can call this hotline, report they're being scammed, and immediately the police can coordinate with the banks and the e-commerce platforms to try to freeze the money and make sure it doesn't leave Singapore. Because I think once the money leaves Singapore or, national boundaries, it becomes really, really difficult to get back. But Singapore's also introduced all kinds of other legislation. Most recently, there's very, arguably invasive legislation that if you are the victim of a scam, but you don't realize you're a victim of a scam, and your family and friends and the police have all tried to convince you as such, and you're still sending money, the government can intervene and actually freeze your bank account. Now, I'm not sure how replicable that policy is in other countries. I can't imagine, majorities of Americans or Australians where I'm from would support that. But that's what we're seeing here. What's really depressing is even though this...
So family and government tell the victim this is a scam and this person doesn't believe them?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. And I think that's something we see across the world. I've heard many stories in America where there's a victim falling for a scam and their family and their friends keep trying to tell them this is a scam, do not send money, and they just keep sending money. But if I could just finish my point about Singapore, what I find really depressing is, even though you have this world-class response from the Singaporean government, if you look at the statistics here, the numbers are still going up. Every half year, the crime statistics show that more Singaporeans are getting scammed and more money is being lost.
So, so much I want to follow up on, but let's make sure we cover down on the role of cryptocurrency. And I confess, I still don't understand cryptocurrency. I don't understand how it works. And it would seem to me that would be a poor way to scam me, because I am so leery of crypto just sort of by nature that and yet what we find is that people are falling for this, and it involves them buying cryptocurrency or investing in cryptocurrency and making what appears to be imaginary money and pouring then more money after that. So why cryptocurrency? What is it about crypto that has sort of led the scammers to use that as the vehicle to butcher the pig, or to fatten the pig up, I should say?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there's a couple of reasons. First of all, I would say that scamming has been around since the beginning of time, since humans figured out how to lie to each other. And I actually went back and tried to find the first recorded scam in history, and I think it was in 300 BC in ancient Rome. But what is different now is the scale and how global it is. And that's because of the internet, social media, AI, and cryptocurrencies. And so it used to be you could only really get scammed in your local community, perhaps face-to-face, perhaps by sending hard cash or a check. But now, someone who's trapped in a compound in the Philippines is able to scam an American in Kansas. So one really important part of that is cryptocurrencies. And often these scams are done through crypto because I think it's very convenient for the criminals. Unlike a traditional bank transfer where there are a lot of personal details attached to our bank accounts, crypto wallets are anonymous. And so an American victim, say, could send crypto to a wallet, and while you could trace where the crypto went, it would be very hard to identify necessarily who owned that wallet that the money was sent to. So I think the anonymity is one of the appeals. I think a second appeal is actually what you just mentioned, Ray, which is most of us don't understand crypto. We vaguely know that, some people have made lots of money and crypto has really gone up. And if we bought crypto a couple of years ago, we'd all be millionaires. But I think that's part of the allure of it, right? It's like, oh, I want in on this. But thirdly, I want in on this, but I don't actually understand how it works. And I guess one of the first rules of investing is only invest in what you understand. But the criminals take advantage of that and sort of confuse people and send them all kinds of charts and statistics. And so then victims think, oh, the only way I can get rich is if I do what this person is telling me to do. And so for all those reasons, I think that's why crypto is one of the most common tools used. That having been said, I've heard a lot of stories of people being scammed not through crypto. A white van shows up at their house and they hand over wads of cash to what they think is the tax department, when in fact it's, a criminal syndicate. And I think even if we were to see governments try to crack down on crypto as an avenue for scamming, the syndicates would figure out ways to pivot and use other tools.
So you mentioned it started in mainland China, and then the government cracked down and drove these syndicates to Myanmar and Cambodia and elsewhere. So is that replicable? Could a real government, say in Cambodia, crack down if they so chose?
I think it's replicable in the sense that, for example, we don't see scam compounds in Singapore. As in, if you're very if your borders are very tightly patrolled, if corruption isn't high, if you really have the rule of law and law enforcement, it's possible to not have scam compounds in your own country. But I think the problem with a country like Cambodia and other countries in Southeast Asia is that these criminal syndicates not only are making so much money for themselves and reinvesting into their businesses, they're also paying off all kinds of people at the highest levels of the business world, the political world, all the way down to sort of local police officers who man the routes between Bangkok airport in Thailand and the Myanmar border, so that, cars of human trafficking victims are sort of waved through. So I think the problem is we're now seeing the rise of scam states. So, in Latin America in the 90s, there was this concept of the narco state. I would say, actually, move over narco state, this is the era of the scam state, where you have whole countries being co-opted by these very wealthy, very sophisticated scam criminals.
So let's get back then, based on that, to your original statement, or the one that I brought up at the beginning, is that this is the most shocking story that nobody's talking about or that nobody's heard of. I mean, and again, we all know about it. I mean, we all get the text messages and the social media messages, and we kind of know that there are scammers out there. And yet the way that we're talking about it here as this thing that is taking over countries and affecting people in this massive way, it doesn't seem like we are reacting to it like we did. We had a whole thing called a drug war, and we sort of still do, trying to crack down on narco states. Why isn't there more of an international effort, or even a national effort in a lot of places, to get after this?
Yeah, it's really good question. One I ask myself. So I think, first of all, I would say there is much more awareness in Asia. It was very funny because my sound designer is Singaporean, and he listened to the series and he was like, I think we can just cut episodes 1 and 2. Like, everyone knows episodes 1 and 2. Why don't we just get to episode 3? And I think there is a bit of that feeling in Asia for people who follow the news that actually the first 2 episodes of Scam Inc. are relatively well-trodden ground. And I hope that sort of our original reporting really shines through from episode 3 onwards. But I guess in the West or in other parts of the world, perhaps even the start of our series is quite shocking and new. But I guess I'd have to throw that back to you, Ray. If you're based in the US, you might have a better sense of the political environment there and why this isn't as big an issue as it is in Asia.
Well, I mean, so I guess what would come to mind is something that you brought out in your series, and you brought out even on this podcast, which is the role of shame. That people who are scammed, once they figure out that they've been scammed, are embarrassed to talk about it. I mean, you have been duped in a very, very personal way. Somebody took advantage of your loneliness. They took advantage of your lust. They took advantage of your greed. And, and you let yourself follow a fraud for month after month, pouring good money after bad. And by the time you get to the end of it, you don't want to tell anybody. You just.
I think that's completely right. And I think the other thing is, even if you do tell someone, I've heard so many stories of people going to their local police stations, gathering the courage, to sort of beat down their shame and going to report this. And the police officer says, "What? But you gave away your money willingly. What's the crime? Like, this is your fault." So I think victim blaming is a huge, huge problem as well as the shame. So first we've got to tackle the shame. Then there's the victim blaming. And I don't think there is enough awareness across the world in law enforcement in understanding that actually this is a crime. Like, these are criminals who are perpetrating these very, very sophisticated scams. And at the end of Scam Inc., we really delve into this question of how do we grapple with the victims, and who bears responsibility for this massive transfer of wealth from middle-class Americans, middle-class all over the world, to a criminal underworld. And then beyond the shame and the victim blaming, I just think it's such a wicked problem. We spoke about the systemic issue of war, poverty, a lack of opportunity driving hundreds of thousands of people to become low-level scammers or part of the Scam Inc. chain in the developing world. Then you've got the governmental level where it's like, unless you tackle every part of the scam chain, from the internet service providers to the telcos firms to the social media companies, to the messaging platforms, to the e-commerce platforms, to the banks, to the crypto exchanges. We haven't even got to law enforcement yet, but that's all the different groups who are possibly involved in a single scam. Unless every single part of that chain is coordinating, it's very, very difficult to really shut down Scam Inc. in your own country. So beyond the structural level and the governmental level, then there's also just at an individual level, I would argue that loneliness is a huge problem in the rich world and only getting more so. And the criminals know exactly how to go after loneliness or whatever it is that we are vulnerable to. And so at an individual level, how do we grapple with the fact we're all in our phones all the time, and there's way less human connection than there used to be for all kinds of reasons that I didn't have time to get into the series, but I think it's all connected.
So I think awareness of this is out there, at least at some level, by and large. But the loneliness or greed overwhelms them. Have you heard of any methods for helping people come to terms quickly to ask themselves key questions like, why is this random person falling in love with me that I've never met? Or is it, it just seems so incredible to me that people could fall for it. Any suggestions for an audience to say what to do when you get a message like this?
I'd actually first say I feel like I went on a journey reporting this series because I started out thinking, what? I would never fall for a scam. Like, I would never be so stupid. And over the course of my reporting, I completely changed my mind. And I now believe I could fall for a scam. I'm not saying necessarily I could fall for a pig butchering scam today after this podcast is recorded, but I genuinely believe that I have weaknesses like any human being. And I think the criminals will be able to figure out those weaknesses and then figure out the right psychological tactics to go after those weaknesses. And I think what I'm particularly susceptible to is where the industry is heading, because it's now not just victims of human trafficking stuck in a compound in Myanmar under atrocious conditions on a smartphone, trying to find people on Tinder or Bumble to pig butcher. Now these criminals are buying very sophisticated AI software, and they're trying to do very targeted scams where they might go and steal a bunch of data from banks or from financial advisors and then go after people on, the list, and knowing how much they have, knowing their net worth, knowing where they live, knowing who's in their family, and try and scam them with all of that information using, voice cloning or face cloning or whatever it is. So I genuinely feel like, given the direction the industry is going in, I could be the target of one of these highly personalized scams. And I really hope I don't fall for it, but I wouldn't say I'm 100% protected.
So yeah, just starting
then the
with
question,
humility, I guess.
Exactly. Yeah. I feel like I came away from this reporting project with much more humility than I started with. And I think I now operate on the assumption that any interaction I have online is a scam until proven otherwise, which is so sad that that's where we're at as a society. But unfortunately, I think we've swung now to that extreme.
But you're saying with new technology, someone you know and trust could be deep faked and lure you into something.
I mean, I think that's already happening. So all you need is 15 seconds of my voice. So all three of us are prime targets because our voices are just out there. And you can insert that 15 seconds into software, and the criminals then can just type in whatever it is that they want, and make you sort of AI Sue-Lin say that. So I've already developed a family code word with my family. I've said to them, if someone calls you saying they're me and sounds like me, and it then asks for money, ask for the code word.
Well, so I was going to save this. You may know that at the end of these, Jim and I have a tradition where we tell each other a story from our careers in foreign service, in his case, military service in my case. And we actually have a story, the both of us, about something like this issue. And so we'll tell it to you. While I was in my very last assignment in the Middle East, I get a LinkedIn message from, quote, Jim Caruso. It was from his account, and it had a PDF document attached to it, and it went to me, and it said basically that he had written something and he wanted me to look at it, which would be something that Jim might do. And so I immediately go in and I try to get into it, and it asks me for a particular password for my mail account. And, being trusting and naive, I actually, the funny thing was, I didn't outsmart the scammer. I outdumbed him because I had mistakenly set up my mail account to send the check to my wife's email instead of my own email. So had I been able to validate and actually get into that, apparently there was some malware in there that was going to take a bunch of my data. And so I tried several times to get into this, and I kept going back to imaginary Jim and saying, hey, I can't open these things. Can't you just send it to me in a Word document? And he said, no, you should be able to do this. And after a little while, I was finally, the lights started to come on, and I'm like, wait a minute, what? Because it didn't really sound like Jim anymore, right? And so I finally reached out to Jim on another platform, and I'm like, Jim, are you trying to send me something? And he's like, what? So, fortunately, I had not succeeded in being dumb enough. I was too dumb to be dumb enough to be scammed in this case. And so they had successfully hacked Jim, but they'd done enough looking into our relationship so that they knew what I might click on, right? What might, and they targeted me for a particular reason, coming from Jim for a particular reason. I ended up, going to I was still in the military. I went to the Office of Special Investigations and, kind of gave them everything. And, I felt some shame having gone that far, but fortunately had not gone deep enough so that I felt too much shame to go confess.
No. I think the message should be we should not be. We should try not to have shame prevent us from sharing with our friends and family what's happening. Yes, I would also feel shame, but I think the message is that's also what the criminals want. They want you to feel shame so that you don't tell anyone, you don't report to the police, and they can continue committing these horrific crimes. So to fight back, try to, I guess, be brave enough to fight the shame and share with your friends and family.
Well, Sue-Lin, this is, I know that I found this to be really illuminating. Your series is fantastic. When I used to sort of imagine what the scammers were, I kind of imagined some, fat hairy guy in his basement, trying to figure out how to take my money, and he would ask for my bank account number, and I'd be dumb enough to give it to him. And actually, the truth is just so much worse. I mean, it is so much worse. And so now I could look through this and I see some poor guy who's been trafficked from a developing country and, perhaps tortured in the other room or listening to the screams of people being tortured and trying to figure out how to get out. And, then this vast criminal network. It really is terrifying and something that I agree. We should be talking about a whole heck of a lot more. So, Sue-Lin, first of all, where can people find this series, and where can people follow your work?
You can find Scam Inc. on any podcast app, and also on economist.com. And you can follow me on X, on Blue Sky, and on LinkedIn.
All right. Well, she is Sue-Lin Wong, and she is the host and the reporter who has done this incredible series, Scam Inc. I highly recommend it. And thank you so much for joining us today.
So, Ray, been scammed today?
I mean, I got to say that series was really intense. I walked away from that really feeling like we are not paying enough attention to this. I just, as I said, I tended to think of scamming as something that bad people did, but I didn't associate it with this vast enterprise. She talked about $500 billion, changing hands. And then if you read this, just the accounts of the people who have been impacted and what goes on in these scam compounds, it's just horrifying.
Well, I have a quick story for you. My parents, who were both in their 80s, get a call, and the person on the other end of the phone says, "Hi, Grandma. I'm in jail in Florida, and they're going to hold me here." And then you hear the phone taken away. "Yeah, we're holding this kid, and unless you send us $1,000 bail immediately, we're going to throw him in the clink, and his record will be ruined," and that sort of stuff. My mother says, "Dante, is that you?" Bubber, right? Yes, it's Dante.
I'm guessing there's no Dante in your family.
There is, unfortunately.
Oh, is there? Oh, well, oops.
But so anyway, they ended up buying a bunch of Apple cards, gift cards.
Mm.
And I said, why do you think a cop but it's the panic.
Right.
If we have to save.
Right.
Oh, and they said, whatever you do, don't call his father because they'll embarrass him. It's like, So they panicked, and out of love, they did this.
Yeah.
Fast forward to last year, my mother gets a similar call, and she says, "Billy, is that you?" "Yes, it's Billy." "Oh, I'm sorry, I don't have a grandson named Billy."
Well, so it is possible to figure it out. Yeah. I would like to think that after listening to 8 episodes of Scam Inc., I'd be much more hardened against this stuff. But I do think, they are very rapidly adapting, and what these things are going to look like in 5 years, much less, further out, it may be completely different. And
the fakes are amazing.
Yeah. So, and I just wonder what it's going to take before all of a sudden this becomes, a national or international priority. So for example, with terrorism, it kind of bubbled along and bubbled along and bubbled along. And then all of a sudden the Twin Towers came down and we went to war. What if there is a scam of such scale that it causes something on the level of a financial crisis? Then maybe it may take something of that scale before it becomes kind of, we figure out that we actually have to do something about this.
Well, I think we have to do something about this.
Yeah. All right. Well, Jim, before we go, we should remind everybody that our generous sponsor is Bauer Group Asia, a strategic advisory firm that specializes in the Indo-Pacific. They apply unmatched expertise and experience to help clients navigate the world's most complex and dynamic markets. And of course, my co-host Jim Caruso is a senior advisor with Bauer Group, and you can see their website at BauerGroupAsia.com if you're interested in their services, which you should be if you are a business in the Indo-Pacific. And our producer is Ian Ellis Jones. We thank him for all of his hard work. You can certainly follow him on X at Ian Ellis Jones. And if you would like to follow us on YouTube because you like to see our pretty faces, then it's going to be youtube.com at iPeak Podcast. Of course, if you're already on YouTube and you like to listen to audio podcasts, we are on all of those platforms. So just pick your favorite. Finally, you can email us, Indo-Pacific Podcast, one word, at gmail.com. Indo-Pacific Podcast at gmail.com. We read all of them. Don't forget to follow our sponsor at BauerGroupAsia.com. For Jim, I'm Ray. Hi, Ian. And we thank you for joining us at Why Should We Care About the Indo-Pacific?